America's criminal codes are now so voluminous that they bewilder not only the average citizen, but also the average lawyer. Harvey Silverglate, in his new book, 3 Felonies a Day, argues that the typical American professional is likely unaware that he or she violates federal law daily. He spoke at the Cato Institute October 1st, 2009. The full event is at cato.org.
Let me explain for a moment the title, 3 Felonies a Day. It's slightly sarcastic, maybe slightly humorous, but the notion is this. An average busy professional in this country gets up in the morning, gets the kids off to school, goes to work, uses the telephone, there we go, federal offense, uses the telephone or email, has meetings, works on a prospectus or a bank loan or whatever, goes home, puts the kids to bed, has dinner, reads the newspaper, and goes to sleep, and has no idea that in the course of that day, he or she has very likely committed 3 felonies, 3 felonies that some ambitious, creative prosecutor can pick out of that day's activities and put into an indictment if the feds so want. And that's, as I said, a slight exaggeration, but really not much. I want to also point out the phenomenon that I'm not talking about. I'm not talking about federalism. Do I personally believe the federal government has usurped areas that should remain with the states? I do, and I also think we're much better off leaving them to the states because the states actually do a better job in a lot of these kinds of criminal areas. But I'm not talking about federalism. I'm also not talking about another problem, over-criminalization, which I know that Cato is very active in dealing with right now. There are so many crimes on the books, the explosion of criminal statutes. I think that's a huge problem, but when you at least can understand them, then you at least have a leg up, because if you can navigate a day. If you understand what the law says, you can presumably navigate a day without becoming a criminal. But when the statutes are vague, you're helpless. You're totally at the mercy of the government because nobody can figure out. Even if you wanted to be a slave, you couldn't figure out how to be a slave because you don't know what you should refrain from doing. So this is a problem separate from, although somewhat related to, the others. Now, Alan Dershowitz wrote a foreword to the book, and he was completely free, of course, to write what he wanted. Some of his theories of how to solve this problem I actually don't agree with, and some I do. But he has a very interesting paragraph about Dershowitz litigated some cases in the old Soviet Union. And he was always taken by the fact that they could prosecute anybody they want because, some of the statutes were so vague, they outlawed hooliganism, see. And, of course, who was a hooligan, I guess, depended on whether the government in power liked you or didn't like you, and that's how they determined if you were a hooligan. And he points out in the foreword that this was a technique developed by Beria, who was the infamous sidekick to Stalin, who said, quote, "Show me the man and I'll find you the crime," close quote. And that really is something that has survived the Soviet Union, has in fact crossed continents, and has arrived here in the good old USA. Show me the man, says any federal prosecutor, and I can show you the crime. It's not an exaggeration. Ask anybody who's been indicted. Ask anybody who's tried one of these crazy cases. It is not an exaggeration. It may not have hit everybody in this room yet, but it certainly can, and it certainly will hit a few. Now, how does this play out in the United States? Why is it that the department does this, Department of Justice? Well, to some extent, this weapon is aimed at unpopular citizens or members of unpopular or suspicious groups. It isn't, I think, the primary impetus, but it certainly is a tool, for example, for going after these days Muslims, political people in a political party out of power. Anybody who happens to be a target for any reason, they go after. But it's hardly limited to just unpopular groups. For the most part, I think these prosecutions are random. They sometimes have a lot to do with ambitions of prosecutors and wanting to get their name in the papers. And sometimes there are prosecutors with psychological disabilities that sort of, they think that it's their job to clean up the world, to clean up the country from dishonest people. Fundamentally, I don't really understand all of the motives that go into the use of these weapons. I only can tell you, I'm not a sociologist, I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist. I can just tell you that these weapons are sprung with alarming frequency and increasing frequency.
Harvey Silverglate is author of 3 Felonies a Day. You can watch the full event at cato.org.